Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ghazal Hamdi, and I'll be discussing John Searle's chapter, What is a Speech Act? John Searle uses this research to continue what John Austin has started. John Austin originated the idea of performative utterances. Speech acts are utterances that have performative functions in language and communication. They don't only present information, but they perform actions. There are three segments of speech acts: a speaker, a hearer, and an utterance produced by a speaker. Before we start, we have to classify utterances into two parts: constitutive utterances and performative utterances. Constitutive utterances are statement-making utterances. They describe a state of affairs, which are either true or false. They are mainly declarative sentences, and they always purport reality. On the other hand, we have performative utterances. It's denoted from a performative verb, like I promise, I warn you, and other performative verbs. They are action-performing utterances, and they don't have any description of a word. They are not classified as either true or false, but instead felicitous and infelicitous. John Searle classifies speech acts into three levels: locutionary acts, illocutionary acts, and perlocutionary acts. A locutionary act is an act of saying actual words that deliver a direct meaning. We call this the referential meaning. A locutionary act, on the other hand, is the act of saying something with a certain intention for a certain reaction from the hearer. We call this the intended meaning. While perlocutionary acts are the responses of both locutionary and illocutionary acts. How will the hearer respond to this act? An example could be performed by saying, "It's hot in here." A locutionary act would mean that the person is actually hot in his place. The illocutionary act would be how the speaker intends for the hearer to open the window, and the perlocutionary act would be the hearer opening the window. Moving on to the next slide, we have what we call illocutionary acts. Illocutionary acts are the main concern of the research conducted by John Searle. They're mainly associated with the intention the speaker intends to deliver to the hearer. It's the function he intends to accomplish. John Searle also says to understand the language, one must understand the speaker's intention. Actions are called illocutionary forces. So by saying something, we do something. When I say it's cold, I need the hearer to close the window. To know how the illocutionary force is interpreted, we have to look for the illocutionary force indicating device. These devices range from stressors, word order, performative verbs, and many more. Searle introduced 5 types of illocutionary acts. We start with the assertives. Assertives represent a state of affairs, claims and suggestions, like insisting or stating something. We have the second one, directives, an act of getting the hearer to do something, like asking for a glass of water. Can someone give me a glass of water? You're not waiting for a yes or no answer, but instead you're requesting something. The third type is commissives. The speaker commits to some future act. For example, an oath or a promise. I promise I'll be there is an example of a commissive. The fourth type, on the other hand, is expressives. Expressives are when the speaker expresses his mental state about a certain event. For example, someone who's just graduated, we tell them congratulations. Last but not least, declaratives are speech acts that change the reality in accord to preposition of the declaration. For example, getting married. I now pronounce you husband and wife is a form of declarative. But in order to follow these types, some felicity conditions should be present. The very first felicity is authority. Certain people are authorized to perform speech acts. For example, a co-worker and a manager. The manager has the authority to fire a co-worker. A judge and a prisoner. The judge has the authority to sentence a prisoner to imprisonment. The second type is sincerity. One must be sincere when conducting an action. and when stating an action. Sincerity must be present. Let's give an example. For example, a child doesn't do his homework, so his mom decides to ground him. She will say, "You are grounded for 2 days." The mother has the authority over her son, and she's sincere that she will ground him for 2 days. Searle believes that to actually state and use illocutionary acts, 3 notions need to be thought of. Searle states that language is a rule-governed activity. That's why he starts with rules. There are 2 types of rules when putting in consideration. The first one is regulative rules. From its meaning, they regulate a pre-existing activity that doesn't depend on rules. He also gives an example of a couple who go to counseling sessions. The couple are already in a relationship, but they need to regulate the problems between them by some rules. The second type we have are the constitutive rules. They constitute an activity which solely depends on rules, like soccer. Searle believes that language is a series of constitutive rules, and illocutionary acts are based upon them. He then mentions the second notion, which are propositions. Propositions are a subject-predicate relationship. They reference to a particular subject and deliver the same meaning. We have several examples. Will John leave the room? John will leave the room, and John leave the room. They all reference to the same subject and verb, that John will eventually leave the room. However, only number 2 is an illocutionary act because it includes an assertion. However, the rest are propositions. And propositions aren't acts at all. But how can we detect the differences between a propositional utterances and illocutionary acts? There are propositional indicators and illocutionary forces indicating device. Illocutionary forces indicating device are what we mentioned earlier, which are stressors, word order, intonation, and performative verbs. As for the propositional indicators, Searle hasn't actually mentioned any indicators because his focal point are illocutionary acts. If you look back to John will leave the room, we have the word will as a stressor because we stress on the word will. John will leave the room. Moving on to the third notion, we have meaning. Of course, we know that meaning is Paul Grice's notion and the main theory he has worked on. So Searle somehow agrees with Paul, but has certain modifications and amendments. Paul Grice states that a person intended the utterance of X to produce some effect in an audience by the recognition of the intention. What Searle seems to argue is that he says that Paul fails to distinguish between the different kinds of effects one intends to produce to the hearer, and that meaning is more than just an intention, but also a convention. So he says that one should make it clear that the intended meaning is more than what the utterance means. Lastly, Searle gives an example of an illocutionary act, which is the act of promising. He then states that there should be some conditions and semantic rules present. He starts with meaning. He says that both the speaker and the hearer should understand each other's language, and that no one is under pressure to speak, as for example, he's threatened, and has no impairments. Moving on to the next point, the promise should be made in the present. For example, I promise to meet you tonight. This is a future act. However, you can promise something in the past. When making a promise, a speaker should put in mind that the hearer will benefit from this promise. The fourth point, intention. The speaker should be sincere with the intention and the promise he makes. Finally, for the fulfillment also of a promise, an obligation should be made that would change the course of affairs. For example, the vows done in a marriage court. To support these conditions, some semantic rules should be present, like the illocutionary force indicating device, which we mentioned earlier are the stressors, intonations, and performative verbs, and many more.
This is a summary of what we have earlier explained.
This is the end of my presentation, and I hope you've benefited. Thank you so much for listening.